The gray blanket landed across her seat like a territorial flag thrown by a man who hadn't even bothered to look her in the eye. People like me deserve this space. He sneered, unaware that the black woman standing before him was not just another passenger, but the CEO of the very airline he was flying. Cameras were already lifting in the tense silence, recording every second. What he thought was a small act of dominance would soon ground the entire flight and strip him of far more than a seat. Olivia Bennett, the celebrated black CEO of Sky Venture Airlines, walked deliberately down the aisle each step, radiating quiet confidence and professionalism. She had just wrapped up a tense board meeting and was mentally preparing for the important appointment she had 5 hours later. Reaching seat 1E, she set down her compact carry-on, intending to review her presentation materials before takeoff. But before she could sit, an unfamiliar male voice rang out behind her, laced with annoyance and arrogance. "I need both of these seats to lie down, move along." Startled, Olivia turned. Standing before her was Richard Thompson, a well-dressed white man in his 50s whose eyes brimmed with contempt. Without waiting for her reply, he deliberately spread his gray blanket over seats 1E and 1F as if he owned them outright. The normally serene first-class cabin instantly grew heavy with tension. Fellow passengers glanced between the two of them, quietly observing. Olivia met Richard's stare, her calm exterior masking the calm, indignation swelling inside her. Still composed, she spoke just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Excuse me. Seat 1E belongs to me. I reserved it, and here is my boarding pass." She raised her phone, displaying her electronic pass on screen. Richard Thompson didn't even look, arms crossed. He laughed derisively. "People like you don't belong here." He snapped his words, dripping with disdain, caused several passengers to frown and share uneasy whispers. A few discreetly aimed their phones to capture the scene in mere seconds. The cabin's peaceful hush had snapped like a taut wire drawing. In a deep breath, Olivia steeled herself. She would not yield to this man's brazen, discriminatory behavior. What began as a minor seat dispute had escalated into an invisible battle for respect and equity, with dozens of eyes upon her. Olivia stood her ground, unwavering, waiting to see what Richard would do next. In her mind, she knew this was about far more than one airplane seat. This was a fight for fundamental respect, and she was determined not to back down. Olivia calmly but firmly held up her ticket. "This seat is mine," Richard sneered. "People like you don't belong here. You should know your place." The atmosphere instantly grew suffocatingly tense. Passengers began to pay attention and discreetly record the scene on their phones. Olivia stood her ground, her gaze resolute and powerful. Richard Thompson studied her carefully, contempt mixed with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. He was the kind of man accustomed to being weighted on his entire life. As chairman of a major investment firm, Richard had never been refused or questioned about his privileges to him. The world always ran by rules. He set power, money, and skin color were his tools for bending others to his will. But Olivia's unexpected composure was more unsettling than anything he'd ever encountered. Richard despised any woman who dared defy him, especially a black woman trying to stand on equal footing. Olivia's authoritative yet graceful presence tested his patience. He leaned forward slightly, eyes challenging. "Let me make this perfectly clear. This is my section. I paid a lot of money to rest in comfort, not to be bothered by people beneath my class." His cutting words sliced through the stifling silence, startling several passengers who exchanged uneasy, confused glances. Some shook their heads in disgust at his outrageous offensive attitude, but Richard didn't care. Other people's discomfort had never troubled him. Olivia remained calm. She knew this battle was not just about her personal rights, but a fight for dignity. Something she'd spent her whole life defending, born and raised in a working-class family in Atlanta. Olivia had fought for years to reach her current position. She'd faced countless people like Richard, those who looked down on her because of her race and gender, and she always chose to stand firm no matter the pressure. "Mr. Thompson," Olivia said softly but decisively, deliberately, using his name to show she knew precisely who he was. "I asked you politely to return my seat out of respect for equality. I expect you to show the same respect to everyone on this flight that I'm showing you." Richard suddenly laughed mockingly, making sure the entire first-class cabin heard. "Oh, equality! I don't think you even understand the meaning of that word, Miss Bennet. But then people like you always see yourselves as victims." His words drove the situation to a fever pitch. Some passengers couldn't hide their anger, but no one dared intervene under the weight of his overbearing authority. A few phones now captured his scowl in sharp relief as he instantly became the living symbol of arrogance and discrimination. Olivia stared at him, her eyes burning with unwavering resolve. In that moment, she silently vowed, even if it meant delaying this flight, she would not back down. This was not just a personal matter. It was time to declare forcefully that power and privilege would never crush respect and dignity amid the anxious gazes of the other passengers. Olivia stood her ground, patiently awaiting Richard's next move, knowing full well that whoever blinked first would lose, and Olivia Bennet had never accepted defeat in her fight for justice. Noticing the situation spiraling out of control, Flight attendant Emily Parker stepped forward gently, trying to diffuse the tension between the two passengers with professional poise, yet a soft touch. She carefully addressed Richard. "Sir, we really must adhere to our assigned seats." Richard whirled on Emily, irritation flashing in his eyes as if she'd just interrupted the most important thing in his day. He hated being told what to do, especially by those he considered to be in the service class. He drew in a deep breath, his tone sharp. "I already told you I have a medical condition. I'm not moving." Those last words landed like a hammer blow on everyone's patience. Emily looked momentarily flustered. She glanced toward Olivia with sympathy and frustration at Richard's obstinacy. As a seasoned attendant, Emily was used to handling delicate situations, but this was beyond ordinary. Richard Thompson had turned first class into his personal stage where everything had to bow to his selfish demands. Seeing the disappointment and helplessness in Emily's eyes, Richard felt triumphant once more, a silent power trip that always satisfied him, raised as the eldest son in a wealthy, influential Boston family. He'd been spoiled his entire life with everyone eager to grant even his most absurd requests. He grew up believing he was somehow above others, especially people like Olivia and Emily, whom he deeply despised. He'd never understood the true value of respect since he had never faced disdain or denial. Himself, Emily stepped back, sighed quietly, and shot Olivia a brief apologetic look. She couldn't force Richard to move if he insisted his health required it. Though everyone knew it was just an excuse for his arrogance, the usually serene cabin now buzzed with hushed whispers of outrage. Who does he think he is? There's no excuse for someone acting like that. Richard heard every murmur, but didn't care. If anything, his posture grew more aggressive, as if to prove he was completely in control. He leaned back in his seat, deliberately spreading his gray blanket wider to challenge Olivia, who remained standing before him, her eyes blazing with resolve. Olivia, despite her anger at his overt bigotry, knew she had to stay calm. She could feel the simmering anger rising in every passenger, but she chose not to react more forcefully. For now, Olivia understood that this fight required patience and steadfastness. With the composure of a CEO who'd faced countless challenges, she was ready to wait for the right moment to make her next move. As the tension in the cabin reached a breaking point, Richard closed his eyes and feigned indifference, unaware that his actions had ignited a slow, burning fire he could never truly control. Amid the cabin's peak tension, a clear, quiet male voice suddenly cut through the silence. "Wait, aren't you?" Olivia Bennet, the CEO of Sky Venture Airlines. Those words rippled through first class like an electric current. Every passenger instinctively turned. toward Olivia, eyes wide with astonishment and admiration. Even Richard, who until now had exuded unshakable arrogance, paused in surprise, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But Richard Thompson never admitted defeat, not even a hint of it. The brief confusion vanished, replaced by his familiar, stubborn scowl. He let out a derisive snort and, deliberately raising his voice so everyone could hear, snarled, "CEO or not, I don't care whoever she is, she can't make me change my mind." His brazen tone drew frowns from several passengers, who at that moment saw Richard's true colors, a man convinced that wealth, power, and social privilege shield him from any criticism or challenge. He'd never bowed to anyone, and he certainly refused to yield to a woman, especially a black woman. Olivia stood silently for a heartbeat, calmly observing Richard's reaction. Her deep, steady gaze betrayed the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating tense, high-stakes situations. As CEO of one of America's largest airlines, Olivia Bennet was renowned not just for her talent, but for her formidable strength and resolve. Raised in an ordinary Atlanta family, she'd climbed every rung of the corporate ladder through her own ability, overcoming countless challenges and prejudices along the way. Olivia understood Richard all too well, the type who believed anything in life could be bought or at least commanded through threats and intimidation. Past experience had taught her that men like Richard Thompson couldn't be reasoned with in ordinary conversation. Sometimes she needed to leverage her own quiet authority to remind them of the basic respect everyone deserves. So instead of arguing further or confronting him, head-on, Olivia adopted a different tactic, one she'd successfully used in countless difficult negotiations. She allowed a gentle, knowing smile to play on her lips, an expression Richard couldn't fully decipher. Then, stepping back with composed grace, she spoke softly but firmly. "Then I guess we'll wait and see." Her words rang clearly through the hush, an unspoken challenge loaded with quiet power. Every nearby passenger sensed in that moment that this was more than a mere personal dispute. It was a collision of dignity and authority, and Olivia Bennet was not about to yield. Richard sat motionless for a moment, struggling to mask the unease creeping into his mind deep down. He sensed for the first time just how formidable Olivia truly was. She was no longer just a woman he could bully or dismiss. She was a force capable of turning his own arrogance into his greatest lesson. All eyes in the cabin now fixed on Olivia with unmistakable respect. While Richard felt increasingly isolated, he gave a frustrated sigh, yet he refused to back down. Richard Thompson's ego was simply too vast to admit he was wrong in his mind. However distorted, his honor demanded he stand his ground at all costs, and so in the heavy silence of the first-class cabin, a silent storm was about to break, and Richard Thompson had no idea that only Olivia Bennet held the power to stop it. In the heavy hush of the cabin, Olivia turned slightly, as if she no longer wished to argue directly, but behind that calm demeanor, she was executing a subtle yet powerful move, one Richard Thompson would never see coming. Gently, Olivia retrieved her phone from her tote. The screen glowed softly with a single deft tap. She sent a brief, prearranged code message operation. Silent Wing, this was a secret protocol she and Sky Venture's top technical team had developed for handling special emergencies, preserving the airline's integrity and safety, above all less than a minute after she hit send. Sky Venture's internal network began acting strangely on Richard's phone. The Wi-Fi icon vanished. He frowned in irritation, trying to reconnect, but all he saw was the cold alert connection unavailable. Richard Thompson had never felt so powerless. A man used to wielding influence. He was used to having immediate fixes at his fingertips. One call, one message, and any problem vanished. But now, the technology that always obeyed him had turned into an unbeatable adversary. A silent fury rose within him, but he realized he could no longer reach the outside world. No assistant, no personal lawyer, completely isolated in midair. Around him, passengers discreetly watched with satisfaction. His previous arrogance and bullying had become the very reason he was being cut off. But Richard didn't grasp that he only felt his anger mounting as if the whole world were turning its back on him toward the rear of the cabin. Emily Parker and Kevin Brooks, the lead flight attendant, exchanged knowing glances. They'd just received internal confirmation on their devices. Silent Wing was active without a word. They both understood it was time to maintain Richard's technical isolation, so he couldn't cause further trouble or stir things up deliberately with his pride-wounded Richard Thompson. For the first time, felt his usual privileges rendered meaningless. His grip tightened on his phone veins, bulging in his hand, pure rage with no outlet. He glared at Olivia, who sat a few steps away, serene yet watchful. Her unfazed composure unnerved him more than anything. Yet it was that very unease and doubt that revealed a darker side of Richard. All his life, he believed absolute power lay in social status and money. He'd never imagined he'd be cast into such passivity. No allies to call on, no way to contact anyone, and worst of all, no one left to back him up. Richard glanced. Around the cabin again, though, no one spoke. Their eyes were full of judgment and reproach. He put on a mask of indifference, but inside his anxiety grew with every passing second nearby. Olivia sat quietly, her gaze drifting softly to the window beneath her calm exterior. She was tracking every development with precision in her heart. A quiet determination swelled, because she knew this fight wasn't simply about reclaiming her seat. This was her moment to prove that true power doesn't reside in arrogance, money, or rank. It lies in respect, dignity, and how you wield them to uphold the most fundamental human values. Olivia inhaled softly, relaxed her posture, and continued to wait. She understood that time was her greatest weapon in this standoff, and the longer it went on, the more Richard's confidence and influence would erode deep down. She knew that by the time this flight landed, Richard Thompson would learn the greatest lesson of his life. Real power never comes from subjugating others. A sense of helplessness, something Richard Thompson had never known, now began to crush his pride. Olivia's steely silence and the passengers' reproachful glances made him feel trapped in an inescapable maze. Finally, he couldn't take it any longer. Seething with fury, he sprang to his feet, his face flushed with anger, and shouted across the first-class cabin, "I want off this plane right now!" His roar shattered the remaining stillness, causing everyone to startle and turn to stare. Never before had Richard lost his composure. Like this, he had always believed he controlled every situation in his life, trusting completely in his social power and privileges. Yet here he was, on a flight operated by an airline he'd assumed existed solely to cater to him, cornered and out of options. Losing all control felt like losing himself. Lead flight attendant Kevin Brooks stepped forward swiftly but calmly, placing himself between Richard and the aisle to prevent further escalation. Kevin, a seasoned professional accustomed to handling complex in-flight incidents, spoke in a steady, authoritative voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Sir, please sit down. We are under a movement restriction." Richard hesitated at the firmness in Kevin's eyes, but his inner rage did not subside. He jabbed a finger at Kevin, trembling with indignation. "You have no right to keep me here. Don't you know who I am? I'll sue this airline and her, too, around him." Passengers shook their heads in disbelief, whispering about Richard's absurdity and loss of control. He had never imagined his own arrogance would leave him so alone under so many unfamiliar eyes. All his life he believed he set the rules and that others must obey. Yet in this moment, his power was unraveling before him, undone by his own selfishness and temper. As Richard grew more agitated, Olivia remained seated, her gaze sharp yet composed. She didn't need to speak. Her silence spoke volumes. Olivia knew that for Richard to truly grasp the gravity of his actions, he needed to face their direct consequences. Kevin stood his ground before Richard, clearly signaling that no further disruption would be tolerated. His stern eyes, honed by years of managing international flights, sent a powerful message. The flight crews and passengers' patience had limits. "Mr. Thompson, we insist you sit down immediately. If you continue to disrupt, we will be forced to take security measures." Kevin repeated his tone, now unwaveringly clear. Richard fell silent for a moment, as if realizing for the first time just how disadvantaged he was. Yet his stubbornness lingered. Richard Thompson, proud of his self-control and superior status, couldn't bring himself to admit he'd ired in his mind. He clung to the belief that money and reputation would shield him from any repercussions, still under the cold star of the other passengers, and Kevin's unwavering resolve. Richard had no choice but to sit his anger, however smoldered on, evident in his furious glare and the white-knuckled grip on his armrest. Now he was the silent object of the entire cabin. Scorn his loss of control had turned him into exactly the kind of weak, powerless man he always despised across from him. Olivia sat as serenely as if Richard's meltdown had no effect on her. But inside, she felt a profound sorrow rather than triumph. She understood that Richard Thompson was not the only one in the world who mistook power for privilege, who believed it granted them the right to trample others' dignity and respect. And she knew that today's battle wasn't just for her. It was for all those who had ever been hurt by arrogance, selfishness, and disrespect for Olivia Bennet. This was no longer a personal matter. It was a vital step in her lifelong mission to defend the inherent value and dignity of every human being. When Richard finally sank back into his seat, the tension in the cabin didn't ease at all. Instead, the oppressive silence pressed in, making every whisper and every slight shake of the head feel louder than ever. For the first time in his life, Richard Thompson felt an unfamiliar pressure, the weight of silent isolation and quiet condemnation from those around him. Suddenly, a clear, controlled female voice rang out from behind him, tinged with anger. "You're the one hogging 2 seats and being rude. You're the problem." The words came from a middle-aged woman sitting nearby, her face etched with frustration and deep disappointment. She fixed Richard with a steely look, as if she spoke for all the other passengers who wanted to say the same. Richard whipped around and glared at her, ready to lash out as he usually did, but he quickly realized he wasn't just facing one individual. He was up against an entire cabin full of people quietly condemning him. Richard tried to compose himself, pointing an angry finger at Olivia and attempting to shift the blame. "She's the one who started this. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have reacted this way." This time, though, his stubborn defense fell flat. No one in the cabin cheered or supported him. The looks directed at him brimmed with indignation and disappointment. Even those who had been neutral just moments before now turned away, rallying silently behind Olivia, who remained dignified and silent throughout. Deep down, Richard began to grasp a painful truth he'd long avoided. His power and status couldn't justify his wrongdoing or arrogance. Confronted by those reproachful, angry stares, he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he couldn't always win by shouting and wielding his privilege. The middle-aged woman wasn't finished. She spoke again, firmly and clearly. "We all see that you're the one who caused this. Instead of apologizing and giving Miss Bennet her rightful seat, you just got more obnoxious passengers around her." Immediately nodded in agreement and murmured their approval. The situation had completely reversed. The man who tried to impose and belittle others was now the one isolated and harshly criticized. Richard sat motionless for a moment, his face draining of color as shame crept in. He had always believed himself invincible, certain everything was under his control and that he was never wrong yet. In this suffocating atmosphere, he realized he was utterly alone, and it was his own behavior that had left him that way. Meanwhile, Olivia stayed calm, her gaze drifting to the window, her expression neither gleeful nor vindictive to her. This wasn't a battle for personal support or a moment to humiliate Richard. Olivia Bennet wanted people to understand that no one has the right to use their privilege to trample another's dignity. Richard Thompson sat quietly, avoiding the probing eyes around him, but inside a fierce storm still raged. He knew he'd been defeated. Yet his stubborn nature wouldn't let him admit it easily. His knuckles whitened on the armrest. his AAs reflecting deep unease even as he tried to pretend he didn't care. But whether he liked it or not, the cabin's collective judgment had shifted, and the only person responsible for the situation was him, Richard Thompson, a man who'd never known the limits of selfishness and arrogance as Richard kept furtively avoiding the disapproving stares around him. The tension in the cabin only mounted as if about to snap. Then at that exact moment, a firm, clear, authoritative voice rang out from the aisle, "Mr. Thompson, this needs to end right now." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Alex Murphy, Sky Ventures' Vice President of Risk Management, a man in his early 50s, renowned for his tough, decisive nature and his calm professionalism in a crisis clad in a sharp navy blue suit. His stern presence instantly commanded the cabin's attention. Alex walked over to Richard, his gaze sharp but controlled with years of handling critical incidents for the airline. He knew exactly how to deal with someone like Richard. Those who believed they were above everyone else, as the highest-ranking Sky Venture official aboard this flight, Alex refused to let the situation drag on. He looked Richard squarely in the eye and spoke, his voice steely and unambiguous: "Return to your assigned seat immediately, or we will be forced to take stronger measures." This was no idle threat. Alex had full authority to call airport security upon landing, and Richard understood it at that moment. For the first time, he felt a deep, unmistakable awareness that he had crossed the line, though he prided himself on fearing no one Alex Murphy's. Unwavering stare shook him reluctantly. Richard rose, his face paling with anger and humiliation, unused to being forced into submission, especially by someone he considered inferior. He knew he had no choice. The stern, disapproving looks from the other passengers, coupled with Alex's imposing presence, left him no room to resist, slowly and resentfully. Richard made his way back to the seat printed on his boarding pass, a surge of fury and shame rising within him. He felt profoundly insulted in front of everyone. The very people he had so contemptuously dismissed as Richard sank into his seat. Alex turned to Olivia Bennett, instantly adopting a respectful, courteous tone. "Miss Bennett, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for what just transpired." Olivia nodded gently, her composure unwavering. She knew Alex Murphy well, a leader who always stood for justice and upheld the airline's values. Yet for Olivia, the apology itself was secondary. What truly mattered was that a powerful message of respect and dignity had been unmistakably delivered. Meanwhile, Richard sat rigidly in his seat, his glare fixed on the window, avoiding every gaze. Anger and shame tore at him as he recognized how completely he had lost the authority and dignity he once wielded right before the very people he had once belittled, Richard Thompson. The self-confident, powerful man he had always been suddenly felt small in the face of unity and righteousness, and for the first time in his life, he understood that true power lies in values he had long ignored: respect, human dignity, and proper conduct toward others. But this realization had come too late, and he knew the damage to his pride was entirely of his own making as soon as Olivia Bennett gently settled into her seat one evening. It seemed as if the entire first-class cabin collectively exhaled in relief. Her calm, composed manner was like a cool breeze that dissolved the tension that had filled the air. Moments before, Olivia said nothing further and made no show of triumph. It was her gracious restraint that truly affirmed her victory and dignity. While Olivia relaxed back into her seat, Richard Thompson remained perched awkwardly beside her, his scowl deepening with every passing second. He deliberately stared out the window, avoiding the scrutinizing glances of his fellow passengers. But that did nothing to stem the low murmur of whispers and critical looks aimed his way only minutes after the incident was resolved. Passengers began sharing videos and photos of what had just transpired. The story spread across social media at lightning speed. Hashtags like respect, Olivia and Sky Venture, justice started trending on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, racking up thousands of interactions and comments in no time. Richard Thompson had no idea that while he was stubbornly clinging to a shred of pride, his name and face were becoming focal points for online outrage clips showing his blatant arrogance and discrimination were being reposted thousands of times, accompanied by comments like, "Unacceptable behavior, they need to take stronger action." Classic example of a man who thinks money gives him carte blanche. Meanwhile, Olivia became a symbol of courage and dignity, earning widespread admiration from people of all backgrounds. Journalists and bloggers began digging into her background, highlighting her career achievements and the biases she'd overcome throughout her life. Olivia's story became a powerful reminder of equality and respect for human dignity, especially in a society where hidden prejudices and injustices still persist. Back in the cabin, Richard sat quietly in his corner, isolating himself from the others each time his phone buzzed with a notification. His anxiety spiked, finally unable to bear it. He unlocked his device and froze. His name was everywhere on social media, accompanied by a storm of harsh criticism. Major news outlets and forums were already reporting on the Sky Venture flight incident, casting Richard Thompson as the embodiment of entitled arrogance, angry and helpless. He tried to fight back by calling his assistant and personal lawyer, but the connection remained completely cut off thanks to Operation Silent Wing. In that moment, Richard realized he was utterly isolated, not just physically in the cabin, but virtually in a digital world he'd always assumed he could control. Olivia sat in seat 1E, gazing thoughtfully out the window. She understood that her true victory was never about humiliating someone else. This was a battle for dignity, respect, and justice values. She had always championed her greatest triumph. Wasn't that Richard was ashamed, but that her story reminded everyone how vital it is to protect human dignity and fairness in everyday life. She felt no satisfaction in Richard's loss of reputation. Instead, Olivia believed this would be the most important lesson of his life, a lesson about respect, humility, and the true meaning of power. She knew that real change often starts with small moments like this, moments when someone stands firm without raising their voice or resorting to threats. For Olivia Bennett, today's outcome wasn't an ending but a crucial beginning, spreading a larger, deeper message about dignity and respect principles she would always defend at any cost. While Olivia sat quietly gazing out the window, reflecting on the deeper meaning of their confrontation, Richard Thompson remained trapped in a state of panic and fury. His hand trembled as he tried to punch in familiar numbers on his phone, only to be met by cold, no connection alerts. The very technology that once symbolized his power and control had now turned on him, leaving him feeling abandoned by the world. As soon as the plane touched down and connections were restored, Richard immediately called his personal lawyer, desperate to reverse his plight and punish those he felt had wronged him. But to his shock, the voice on the other end spoke with an unfamiliar detachment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson, but our firm cannot represent you in this matter." Stunned, Richard felt as though someone had struck his pride. With a hammer, he dialed every high-profile law firm that had previously secured victories for him and safeguarded his interests, but each one politely declined, offering vague excuses that were clearly deliberate. Within hours, Richard realized he'd become persona non grata. No one wanted to side with him anymore. Even the big law firms that once leapt at the chance to defend him for the promise of prestige and profit now recoiled under the fierce pressure of public outrage. His wealth and influence, he saw, counted for nothing in the face of society's backlash. Over the following days, the reputation he'd painstakingly built over decades shattered like broken glass. News outlets and social media churned out scathing articles branding him a poster child for arrogance, racism, and misplaced privilege in modern society. Longtime business partners distanced themselves. Company shareholders demanded his resignation. Colleagues who once respected him now turned their backs. No one wanted anything to do with Richard Thompson at a specially convened board meeting held soon after Richard entered the familiar conference room, feeling utterly alien. The director's stares were icy and unsympathetic. The board chairman announced unequivocally that Richard's continued leadership would seriously damage the company's reputation and interests. Richard tried to defend himself, citing his past achievements and contributions, but none of it carried weight against the tidal wave of public condemnation. In the end, he was forced to step down in bitterness and humiliation, leaving as a man stripped of all power and prestige. As he walked out of the building where he had once wielded absolute authority, he passed colleagues whose cold, reproachful gazes underscored the depth of his fall. For the first time, he realized he had lost not only his position and power, but also the respect of those who had once admired him back at his vast, now empty mansion. Richard sat alone in the dark, engulfed by loneliness and helplessness, the very things he had trusted. Money, power, social status had betrayed him, leaving him to face the consequences he alone had created. He confronted the bitter truth that he was the architect of his own downfall. His arrogance, selfishness, and disdain for others' dignity had come at an unbearable cost. The image of Olivia Bennet returned vividly to his mind, the composed, dignified black woman he had assumed he could easily bully and dismiss. Now he understood that true strength lay with her. Her power sprang from respect from principle and from the courage to defend justice without resorting to loud words or threats, sitting silently in the darkness. Richard Thompson was consumed by belated regret. He recognized that he had become a living lesson. No one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, has the right to trample on another's dignity or respect. It was the most costly lesson of his life, one he would never forget. As Richard Thompson sat alone in his empty mansion, struggling to accept the bitter lesson about the consequences of demeaning others' dignity and respect elsewhere. Olivia Bennet was embarking on a journey to enact deeper lasting change. The incident on that flight was more than a personal victory. It marked the beginning of a comprehensive cultural and values overhaul at Sky Venture Airlines. As soon as she returned to headquarters, Olivia convened an emergency meeting with the senior leadership team there. She laid out with clarity and resolve the measures needed to ensure that nothing like this ever happened again. Her steady gaze and calm but forceful voice conveyed a single, unambiguous message. Sky Venture is not just an airline. It must become a model of equality, respect, and inclusion in society. Over the following weeks, Olivia spearheaded a series of new policies, rolled out company-wide mandatory training programs on anti-racism, gender equity, and cultural diversity were launched at an unprecedented scale. Employees at every level were required to participate in and complete courses on awareness, appropriate conduct, and respect for everyone's rights, no matter their race, gender, or social background. Most notably, Olivia established a dedicated Diversity and Inclusion Council charged with overseeing the implementation of these policies across every facet of the airline, from cabin crew interactions to hiring processes. Every detail was scrutinized to ensure that every Sky Venture team member understood their responsibility to uphold fairness and human dignity. These reforms quickly won broad support from the public, and the media, social justice experts, and human rights organizations praised Sky Venture's sincere, serious commitment, calling it a major step forward for equality in modern business. As the positive changes gained momentum, press and social media began nominating Olivia Bennet for prestigious awards to honor her courage and visionary leadership. Yet Olivia, ever humble, declined every personal accolade. At a major press conference, she addressed hundreds of reporters with heartfelt sincerity. "I'm deeply grateful for everyone's support, but let me be clear, these changes are not about honoring me. My sole aim is to ensure we build an environment where respect, equality, and inclusion are held as our unshakable core values." Her genuine humility only deepened the community's respect for her. Olivia's example of principled leadership became part of academic case studies in business schools, a shining example of leading with dignity and courage. Meanwhile, Richard Thompson watched Sky Ventures, sweeping reforms with bitterness and regret. He understood that his own arrogance and stubbornness had served as the catalyst for these powerful changes. From now on, his name would stand as a cautionary tale, an emblem of what happens when one chooses to trample on human dignity. Olivia Bennet, by contrast, turned a negative incident into an opportunity to transform the broader community. She recognized that true power doesn't lie in flashy titles or fleeting fame, but in the ability to create positive, enduring impact for Olivia. These reforms at Sky Venture were the greatest reward of her career. And Sky Venture's transformation was not a fleeting gesture. It was a bold, definitive statement that the era of misplaced privilege has truly ended, and that the future belongs to a culture where dignity, respect, and equality are always protected and revered. As Sky Venture's sweeping reforms began to take hold, that fateful flight came to symbolize something far greater than an ordinary event. When the plane lifted off again, it wasn't just an aircraft soaring into the sky. It carried a powerful message of dignity, equality, and respect, one that Olivia Bennet had upheld with calm courage and quiet determination. In the months that followed, Olivia kept the boarding pass for Seat 1E tiny and worn, yet monumental, in a place of honor on her desk. To her, it wasn't merely a personal memento. It stood for the journey. So many of them were still on every day, the fight to protect everyone's rights and dignity, no matter their race, gender, or social standing. Meanwhile, in his cold, empty mansion, Richard Thompson wrestled with the heavy fallout of his actions each time his name popped up in news headlines or social media feeds. It felt like a fresh blow to his wounded pride. Once respected and powerful, he had become a living example of what happens when someone abuses power and tramples on another's dignity. Yet in those long, lonely nights of reflection, Richard also came to realize something he'd never admitted. Before dignity and respect cannot be bought with money or imposed through authority. They are fundamental human values everyone deserves. He wondered how his life might have turned out differently if he'd recognized that sooner. While Richard grappled with his regret, thousands of passengers who disembarked that special flight found themselves changed too. They left the plane not only relieved that the crisis was over, but carrying a fresh perspective on the world, a world where true strength comes not from domination or coercion, but from courage, dignity, and mutual respect. Sky Venture became renowned as the airline with the strongest culture of respect and equality in the industry. The reforms Olivia championed sparked profound change, turning Sky Venture into a model for other companies to follow. Every employee, from pilots and flight attendants to ground staff, understood that they represented the core values of dignity and respect that Olivia had so bravely defended. Olivia Bennet's story didn't just inspire those who witnessed it firsthand. It spread to schools, universities, and community organizations everywhere. Her example of standing firm in her principles calmly yet courageously became a powerful lesson for young people, showing them they too could defend their rights and dignity without violence or hatred. Olivia sought no titles and accepted no individual awards. She knew that a true legacy isn't built on fame or personal accolades, but on the shifts in awareness, attitudes, and behaviors she helped create in her rare moments of quiet reflection. She would smile at the thought that her small act that day had contributed to making the world a little bit better, and though Richard Thompson, once the poster child for arrogant selfishness and misplaced privilege, had also become part of this lesson, his life was now a testament to the enduring truth that genuine values, dignity, respect, and humility must never be dismissed or trampled. Ultimately, the greatest legacy of that fateful flight was this awakening. Each of us bears the responsibility to uphold equality and human dignity, not only for ourselves but for everyone around us. And in this long journey, Olivia Bennet never walked alone. Thousands, even millions, drew inspiration from her story. To stand up for those same values for Olivia, that little boarding pass for Seat 1E was more than just paper. It was the vivid emblem of an ongoing struggle, one she had fought, continues to fight, and will always fight with all her courage and integrity. Olivia Bennet's story is a powerful testament to the strength of dignity and respect, and a poignant reminder of our collective duty to confront injustice wherever it arises. What do you think of how Olivia handled this situation? If you were in her shoes, would you have done the same? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and share to spread its positive message, and subscribe so we can bring you more stories of courage and social justice. Thank you for listening.